My name is Lily Kajabi. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Stop Data Subcommittee of the RIPA Board, and I see another co-chair, Sheriff Chad Bianco's here. And so I'd like to, I guess, call the meeting to order and begin by welcoming everyone to the critical work of the board. I'd like board members to introduce themselves individually. So maybe I'll begin starting at the mic. So as I mentioned, I'm Lily Kajabi. I'm a professor of mathematics at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles in Southern California. And I'm an appointee of the Attorney General's office. I'm going to go ahead and pass around. I'll invite board members to pass to other board members after they introduce themselves. Sheriff Bianco, would you like to go next?
Sure. Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco, representing Cal State Sheriff's Association. And I can't see anyone else on my screen. Someone save me and step up.
I'd like to step in then. And so may I ask board member Chauncey Smith, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Chauncey Smith, Catalyst, California, appointee of Attorney General. I will pass it to Darren.
Good morning, everyone. Captain Darren Green, California Highway Patrol, standing in for Commissioner Sean Dury. I'm a delegated position for him. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. John Dobard with Catalyst, California, appointee of Speaker Emeritus Anthony Renton.
May I ask if there are any other board members attending? I don't see others on my end, but I want to make sure that I don't miss anyone.
I believe you're right, board member Kajabi. Those are the subcommittee members that are meeting today.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And so our first order of business is typically approval of the minutes. So I'm going to ask folks if they'd like to open up the minutes to take a look. And before we entertain motions, if there are any comments or corrections, and I have three brief corrections, friendly amendments that I'd like to share with DOJ. Let me just bring up those in my end as well. And let's see. Let me see if I can find the best order for doing these. Actually, maybe if folks from DOJ are listening, I'm just going to go ahead and chime in. So these are three amendments I'd like to entertain. Right at the beginning of section 5, there's a note that I'd stated that the 2024 data is posted in Open Justice, but I believe actually it's 2023 that's posted, and 2024 is now being analyzed and will be posted. But so it's a minor correction, but I think that's important if folks are looking for that data, that they would need to make a public request at this point to access it. So right after section 5. Secondly, there was one comment about pedestrian, let me find it. Sorry, I didn't write down the page numbers. Frisk and search rate. So let's see, this is in section 5. On page 5 of the PDF file, about halfway down, I made also a comment about separating pedestrian and bicycle stops. So it's just a 2-line paragraph. And I made a comment that frisk and search rates were disproportionately high for pedestrians. We, of course, haven't analyzed this year's data yet. That's a reference to historical LAPD data. And so I'm proposing adding historically for LAPD. So this was under data from the consent decree that the LAPD was under. And so in other words, that statement wasn't yet about analysis of frisk and search now for pedestrians, but looking backwards. Alex, I see you nodding. Were you able to find the spot where that was? So it's just a minor comment, but I just want to clarify that it's the basis for considering stated now. And then finally on I think it's on near the last page, there was a quote shared last time by Board Member Guerrero, very profound quote attributed to the CHP Commissioner, that in discretion, the bias blooms. That is that we can aim for policies that are very clear, but that when we look at cases where there's offers for discretion, those are of particular interest. At any rate, this is on the right before section 6. And so in particular, it's on page 8. And so Board Member Guerrero cited this really, I think, profound quote from the California Highway Patrol Commissioner, but it's incorrectly attributed to me here raising that, and I just would like it changed to indicate that Co-Chair Guerrero stated this. So this is in the second paragraph on page 8. It begins Co-Chair Kajabi, that's fine, but midway down, then it should be Co-Chair Guerrero. And I'm wondering, Alex, did you see that line? Okay, great. I know these are small changes, but I feel like it's part of the historical record, and I appreciate that. And so with those friendly and minor changes or updates, I would be happy to entertain motions to approve the minutes. We can also take another minute as folks are settling into.
And one other, so we do see that. Thank you for that, Co-Chair Kajabi, and just wanted to let you and the rest of the board members know that Board Member Hawkins is also joined.
Oh, great. May I ask, LaWanda, are you able to? Yeah, please introduce yourself. Thank you. We're so pleased to have you here.
Glad to be here. Good morning. My name is LaWanda Hawkins. I was appointed by former Governor Jerry Brown and reappointed by the Governor Gavin Newsom. I'm in Southern California. I'm part of an organization called Justice for Murdered Children, and I'm glad to be here this morning.
Thank you so much. So at this moment, we're looking at the minutes with some minor clarifications made, and when we're able to, we'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Thank you, Linda.
Chad Bianco, I'll make a motion to approve with the amended changes.
Board Member LaWanda, I second it.
Okay, with that, would DOJ organize a roll call vote for us? If this one is by roll call. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair Kajabi. This is a motion to approve the amended March 5, 2025 minutes with the following amendments on page 3, that the reference to 2024 data is actually changed to 2023 data. It's posted on Open Justice. Reference on page 5 that the quote, excuse me, that the statement also references that this is for historically for LAPD data and not a reference to RIPA data. And reference on page 8, a quote misattributed to Co-Chair Kajabi that should be attributed to Board Member Guerrero. Take a roll call vote now. Board Member Bianco.
Approve. Aye.
Bianco, aye. Board Member Dilworth.
Abstain.
Joe Bardo abstain. Board Member Green.
Aye.
Green, aye. Board Member Hawkins.
Aye.
Hawkins, aye. Board Member Kajabi.
Aye.
Kajabi, aye. Board Member Smith.
Yes.
Smith, aye. And the motion passes on a vote of 5-1 abstention.
Pardon me, I was muted there for a moment. Okay, and so moving on, let me just bring up our agenda again. And so we're going to pass now to updates from the DOJ, in particular in regard to the stop data section or in general. And so can I invite members from DOJ? We look forward to your presentation.
Hello, subcommittees. I'm going to get the slides up for the update here. One moment, please.
Thank you, Gary.
All right. Okay, so thank you. I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly because there's also a presentation coming from the research services. Oh, sorry. Is someone? Thank you. All right. So one thing about the 2026 report that was discussed in the previous full board meeting, and then also has additionally been discussed in meetings last week, is that we're looking at a focus for this year's or the 2026's reports focus of the kind of a theme and focus on public safety, the impact of racial and identity profiling on public safety in particular. And so a definition that was offered by the policy subcommittee last week was that public safety could be defined possibly as the experience of community members being and feeling safe from threats to their lives or well-being. And so this is maybe kind of going to be a focus for the report. And so maybe that's something we can consider how we use the RIPA stop data to maybe aid in this focus. Are there particular data elements or things collected that we should be focusing on that relate to public safety and maybe this definition of public safety? And also, is there an analysis that we could do that could maybe speak to the impact of racial profiling or other activities related to the RIPA data collection and the impact on public safety? So that's something that maybe we can consider and discuss in the subcommittee meeting today. And so some additional analysis that we've already discussed, I think, in the previous meeting, but also just to kind of remind and also maybe think of some new ones too, is that we in the stop data section this year, we have some new data elements with now a better definition and kind of differentiation between vehicle, bicycle, and pedestrian stops. And so maybe we can consider kinds of ways to further differentiate and analyze those stops. For example, right now we do for vehicles, we look at moving, non-moving, and equipment violations. And one analysis we could do is that we could perhaps perform something similar in looking at moving, non-moving, and equipment violations for example, bicycles. And also there aren't really equipment violations for pedestrian stops, but maybe there's a differentiation in the pedestrian stops that's similar to kind of moving or non-moving kind of, the violations that might occur for a pedestrian just walking around. And is there kind of differences there that we want to look at, and is that important? There are analyses that maybe relate to public safety. You're going to be hearing more from the research services on some of these. What we're looking at kind of doing a hotspot and concentration analysis. We're going to hear more about that from research services. We can be doing a more detailed analysis of consent searches of the outcomes of consent searches, and we have a little bit more information on consent searches this year in the RIPA stop data collection. We can and then also we might want to look at the agencies that have prohibited pretext stops and look at the differences there, and conduct analysis there. We also are collecting some more information about the officers who are conducting the stops this year. This year, we have been collecting the self-identified race and ethnicity of the officers conducting the stop, and that there might be an analysis there, and also in particular considering other characteristics of the officer. For example, we do collect the years of experience. That might be kind of important, kind of related, and maybe other elements of the stop data collection we can consider in looking at perhaps how the officer's characteristics, identity characteristics or experience affect in some ways their behavior or the experience of people in public when they're stopped by officers. And another thing is that we might want to kind of do a further dive on the analysis of durations of stop. I think there's some interest in that from last year, and the continued look at that. And additionally, we are starting to collect kind of a volume of data so we can look across years. So particularly with the first year of data collection, we're now getting to the point where we can really look at many years of stop data collection in the RIPA data set. And so are there questions that we want to ask about Wave 1 agencies across that set of time that we've been collecting? And so one other area that I would like to get kind of more settled, and so that we just have direction here in putting together the stop data section, is I would like kind of further direction on this of how we organize the stop data section. So generally, the stop data section has been organized by the flow of the stop or the event first, and then the demographic information, the identity characteristics of the person stopped were after that. And however, in the 2025 RIPA report, we did something a little different, which was that we had the normal organization, but we didn't really discuss youth specifically in that first section. And then we had a separate section that was focused on youth, and we actually focused on the kind of, it was organized more by the youth characteristics, and then going forward on that, and kind of it allowed someone to kind of more dive deep in on how maybe youth is affected. So in the 2026 report, would we like to maybe look at the way that we organize information on youth in the 2025 report, and then maybe kind of consider that as the format for the whole stop data report, where we kind of have a more of a kind of organized focus on the characteristic of the identity characteristics of the person stopped first. So we kind of focus in on, we talk about, well, I'll show examples next, but or would we want to continue the practice of organizing information by the stop event first? Or maybe is there something in between that we're looking at? Like maybe there's a characteristic that we want to pull out for the public safety theme, or something else like that. And so we have like a second section that's kind of a more focused section. So that's something to consider. So I think some advantages of sorting by identity characteristic first is this kind of organized by the more generally understood category first. I think more people generally understand identity demographic characteristics first, and then so there's an explanation of stop event next, but maybe it allows the reader to kind of hone in on maybe the topic they're interested in first. And also allows someone to consider more the differences in the identity group composition how that impacts the next stop. So, one group might be searched more often, and that has an impact on how we understand the differences in the discovery rate. So if a group is searched a lot more often, and there's the differences in the discovery rate might make you have a different opinion on the fact that they're being searched more often, or might maybe lead someone to different conclusions. And then also it allows the reader to more readily connect events of one group across the stop. So you're not kind of being broken up about, you're not hearing about the stop and all things happening in the stop all at once. And you're able to kind of focus in on how that one identity group or characteristic is, the differences that are happening between that stop. And then also it may help someone kind of understand a better, give a reader a greater focus on the systemic bias by the identity group. So what that might look like is an example here, and I can also show some like a PDF mock-up if that's desired. But we would first, for this kind of organization, we would start by introducing just a general description of it. So if we were doing identity characteristic first, we would start by describing like the total number of stops and defining the practices within stops and other terms. And then we would go look at race and ethnicity, and we would look at calls for service by race and ethnicity, and then all the other kinds of events within the stop, and then ultimately ending with results of stop by race and ethnicity. So we would see, we would kind of have it more focused in on what is happening from event to event and the differences in the composition of those events by race and ethnicity before we, and then we might actually, for example, so mode of travel might be a separate kind of identity characteristic we might be interested in. So for that we could have mode of travel, and then we could look at the calls for service by mode of travel. And then maybe we'd also, for this, we'd want to look at the race and ethnicity intersection for mode of travel. And then, so for some of these, we would definitely want to look at the intersectionality with race and ethnicity, given that this is the Racial Identity Profiling Advisory Board. And the, so we would go through calls for service, searches, discovery, actions taken, results of stop, etc., and then move down to the next identity group, gender, and look within gender and all the different events within there. How we've been doing is we've been kind of sorted by the stop flow, or kind of the events within the stop, and this is more focused on the particular practices within a stop. So it may be more useful to understand the impacts of a particular police practice. Like if we really want to focus in on, for example, search practices or something like that, we could kind of see how different, how a search practice is affecting groups across the board. It also kind of, this is also what we've been using previously generally, is that we've been doing the stop flow organization. And so this is kind of, I think, more familiar so we've started by introducing the general description of the stop data. So describing the total number of stops typically is how we start. And then we'll say like calls for service, and then we'll look at calls for service by race and ethnicity, calls for service maybe by mode of travel, race and ethnicity intersection, calls for service by gender, disability status, English fluency, and those kinds of group characteristics. And then we'd move on to reasons for stop. We'd look at, sorry, a little typo here, but yeah, so this should be reasons for stop, but reasons for stop by race and ethnicity, reasons for stop by mode of travel, race and ethnicity intersection, and then reasons for stop by gender, disability, English fluency. Then we get down to results of stop, things like that. So anyway, I can also, I have a kind of PDF mock-up of what some pages of these might look like if that's desired, but I don't necessarily need to present those given the time constraints, but I can also present them later if that's a question the board has while they're having the discussion. And so, yeah, and then I'm going to hand this off to research services soon, but, kind of how can the stop data section, this topics for discussion for this meeting is how can the stop data section contribute to this year's theme of public safety? What kind of data analysis should we be included in the stop data section this year, and particularly with the focus on public safety, and then also the new data elements. And then also one other thing to consider is that how should data be organized by individual characteristic, by stop event, or something else? Maybe something like last time where we had a breakout for one particular identity characteristic, or maybe we have a breakout for one particular practice. And so I can take questions now, and then I'll also be available for questions after this. As the meeting continues. So if anyone has questions.
Garrett, is it easy does the PDF include, for example, I don't know, like examples of bar graphs where it's either you could have something, let's say we're looking at search rates by race and ethnicity. It shows across the board for different members of the California population, how the search rates vary, and then separately something for discoveries, let's say, and so on, versus were you imagining instead, if you're disaggregating by identity first, were you also imagining presenting, let's say, a search rate and relative to a discovery rate? Is that how you're thinking about the second approach? Does the PDF, I don't know what's in the PDF.
Mentioned it,
so of course
it's kind of one page, but yeah, so I mean, I think so the difference here, right, is that, so if you're looking at stop data, so let's say we're looking at search rate, right? So do we want to have all the different differences in search rate altogether, or do we want to have all the differences in identity characteristics altogether? And then there would still be the search rate kind of visuals, right? But would the search rate visuals be spread? Would they be kind of spread across? And then you would look at the stop rate, the search rate, other kinds of differences between the identity characteristic. Would those graphs and those charts be together more closely by identity characteristic, or would you be looking at the search rates for right next to each other? Would you have the search rate for identity characteristics like race and ethnicity, gender, English fluency? Would those be kind of more closely to just?
Does the PDF give an example of that, or do you want? Is it something you wanted to share, or?
Yeah, I can share some. Yeah, I can share the PDF. I was just I think one issue is that we want to make sure that I get to the presentation with research services, but I can show it. So the issue is it is a written document. I'll just show it real quick what I have of a mock-up, and then
I think while we're entertaining this question,
yeah. So yeah, I'll just
thanks everyone for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can let's see. All right, here we go. So there we go. So this might be how, if it's organized kind of the top level is race and ethnicity, we would see, we would start by a discussion of kind of who's the composition, who's being stopped. And then we would look at, this is kind of based on what was in last year's report, but it would be then discussion of the calls for service and the differences in race and ethnicity within calls for service, the differences in race and ethnicity for reasons for stop, and all these kinds of things. And they would all be kind of this kind of category of information of race and ethnicity would be all taken in together, right? And then it's kind of a rough approximation, but as you can see, it's kind of all together for race and ethnicity in what would be, you look at initially. And so if this is how we've more typically done it, is what we might just start with calls for service. And then we have the differences in calls for service here written out: race and ethnicity, gender, disability, English fluency, LBGT identity, that kind of thing. And then that would be, that's kind of a difference, is that, just basically how it's organized like that. It's kind of, it is kind of, maybe in some ways it's superficial, but I do think it kind of matters to the way someone is kind of focusing in on the report. And then also kind of how they think about how one event affects the next is also kind of broken up a little bit in some ways. But then also there's the issue of intersectionality, where, people are belong to multiple identity characteristics. And so there might be also a consideration there for kind of focusing on the practice, because you might be more, you might be also interested in the kind of differences within the group, between the groups experiencing. Someone's, belongs to ultimately all of these categories at some point, so there's. And
did you have a mock-up of an example that you thought of as a different?
Yeah, so this would be, this is the stop event first. This is the kind of event flow first one. It's just one page, right? And then and then I'll actually the whole, for the most part, most of the reports are in the stop event first format, but this would be how it would be if it was identity characteristic first. See, so if it was identity characteristics first, we would have the information about race and ethnicity basically all together. And the differences in race and ethnicity all together. So for example, it would be start with calls for service and differences in the kind of the groups being affected by calls for service differently. And I have like a even more expanded one, but I think that this is a good picture on this. And yeah, so if you have particular questions about that, but it just kind of is how you are looking at the report. Are you kind of focused in on the kind of experience of one identity characteristic across the events, or are you looking at the different events and then the differences of the different identity characteristics with the event? I mean, it's kind of, in some ways it seems kind of small, but it is, I think it does create a difference in perspective, and it's kind of, and there might also be a condition where there's a particular thing that we want to pull out, like last year we pulled out youth as this own kind of broken out, highly expanded section.
Okay, so I'm trying to get a better understanding of how these are somehow different approaches. It's true that in the past we've looked at, for example, search rates, and then it is by race and ethnicity. I just want to clarify, it's not that we somehow looked at searches like everything else, what has been disaggregated by
Ye-
essentially
Yeah.
by race or ethnicity, which is, I mean, a fundamental call to the board is to look at race and identity profiling. But if so, but it sounds like you're saying in part so that there's some better capacity for intersectional analysis that and potentially other breakdowns that you prefer to disaggregate first by race and ethnicity. Is that what I'm
So
hearing,
I
understanding?
guess basically is do we want the reader to make the connections of to look at it and see this is race and ethnicity, this is the kind of the differences of race and ethnicity across the different stop flow events, or and that's kind of the first thing that the reader kind of interprets, right? Or do we
All
want the
of
reader
it.
to kind of, and that this will include all of the, and it's going to include all the information. It's just how is it organized, right? Are we organizing at the top level by because we can't we can't show everything at once. We have to kind of choose what order we show things. So do we show race and ethnicity and then the different events within race and ethnicity, or do we show an event and then the different identity characteristics within that first in written? And it is kind of, it will be ultimately the same information that's shown. It's just when the reader's looking at it, what does the reader kind of pick up on first? What does the reader kind of notice first if they're not kind of going back and forth and flipping between pages? Because in some ways, like, how it is kind of like, there is kind of, if you want to understand what's happening for one identity group across all the events of a stop, you kind of have to be flipping through pages in some ways. But on the other hand, if you want to understand one particular event, stop event, you have to kind of flip between pages if we changed it to being at the top level identity characteristic first.
Great. So I know we're going to have another presentation as well, but can I just ask, are there any questions or comments that any board members want to make at this moment while we're have Garrett's here directly and while we're focused on this issue? Or shall we circle back after the other presentation? Wanda, great to see you. I just wanted to say now, I can see everyone on Teams. Okay, so well, why don't we, Garrett, I appreciate that. I think what we're going to do is circle back then. We'll move to the other presentation. Thank you so much.
Hi, so I will get my presentation ready. Let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today. My name is Dr. Eric Van Holm. I am a Research Data Specialist 3 at Research Services within the Department of Justice, and I am the lead specialist on the RIPR portfolio. Today's presentation is less numbers heavy than a typical presentation from Research Services. In later months, we'll be giving previews of what the data shows. And while we've had the 2024 data for about a month, we have not yet begun doing the analysis on it in earnest. Our time with the data has been spent cleaning it and preparing it for the analyses to come. But as of today, we have no results for you. That said, I can let you know the size of the data. There's about 5.1 million stops in 2024. That's about 400,000 more than we had in 2023. And we got that data from 533 agencies. But those are the only numbers that we're ready to show today. While we don't have any results, what I am here to talk about is our proposal for analyses. We've been part of the meetings throughout the year where the board has discussed what they wanted to see done this year. And we've taken that and grouped it into 2 sets of analyses, which I can describe today. We're going to be proposing 2 analyses or 2 sets of analyses that are going to have almost a dizzying number of questions included underneath them. The first set of analyses is at the agency level. The second set of analyses is at the stop level. And so we'll go into some detail about what we're talking about with both of those. Of course, with this presentation, we're open to feedback. We're open to suggestions on ways to modify this to better fit what the expectations of the board are. And we're looking forward to getting started on this in the next few months. And so the first set of analyses is at the agency level. During meetings, the board has been very interested in the potential of a regional analysis using the RIPA data now that we have it for all agencies across the state. And that's sort of to understand this data at a higher level beyond sort of the individual stop, and to understand differences within agencies as well as regions. These analyses have been described in a few different ways throughout the meetings. Hotspot and concentration have been used. Because we don't have sort of individual geolocation on each stop, we're not really able to do a hyper local analysis at like a hotspot level, but we are able to look across regions. Stop data is collected at the stop level for each individual stop. We're able to aggregate those stops to the agency level in order to understand those differences across agencies. And I list a few of the outcomes that we can study by aggregating the stop data to the agency level. And so the types of things that we can study in an agency analysis are things like the percentage of stops for each agency of different racial groups as sort of a raw statistic, what percentage of stops for each agency are of Blacks, what percentage of stops are for whites. And we may also be able to compare those to community regional demographics, which agencies have the most disproportionate percentage of stops of Blacks, which agency has the most disproportionate share of stops that are of Asians, or those types of questions. We can also look at the agency, what percentage of stops for each agency end in arrest or no action or different types of result of stop. We can look at search as an outcome of stop and look at what percentage of stops for each agency have different types of search. Consent only is often a topic of discussion for the board. And we can also look at actions within a stop and see what percentage of stops for each agency, again, feature use of force, different or other types of selected actions that are of interest. And so these are sort of the outcomes that we can study looking at the agency level. And we can look at those as sort of a raw statistic and look at, which agency has the highest percentage of stops that have a certain result of stop or actions within it. But we can also look within the stop to understand different regional or agency level factors that drive or that may influence or be associated with those outcomes. And so a spatially weighted model allows us to understand how geography, how region, how different definitions of region may have an influence or be associated with these different outcomes. And allows us to look at the effect of multiple variables while controlling for other factors that may influence those outcomes. And so what are the sort of factors that we can look at? Of course, the data comes at the stop level, but we can aggregate those stops and we can bring in external data on counties and to some degree on agencies to understand different factors of the region and agency. And so some of the different things that we can look at and for their influence on those outcomes are county population or demographics, looking at either county or regional demographics, shares of different racial groups, shares of gender, shares of different things that the census collects for interest. We can also look at urbanization and commuting patterns in terms of population density, which may have some influence on how outcomes for agency. We can also bring in crime rates at the county level. We can look at the agency type in terms of whether it's at a school, a sheriff's office, a police department. And depending on some different issues with the officer ID, we may be able to look at sort of the size of agency in terms of either the number of stops they have, which might impact sort of the outcomes of interest, or maybe the number of police officers that are involved in stops. And so as we sort of understand it, and as the question was sort of defined, agencies cluster within regions. And because this is stop data, individuals are moving throughout regions, they're moving throughout communities, and these agencies are serving both sort of a local area, but also they're serving people throughout a region as people move. And so there's a set of questions that we can answer by looking across regions and by looking across counties. And so this snapshot on the right side of the screen is just of Riverside, San Diego, and Imperial counties, which are just 3 counties to take an example. And this is mapping all of the agencies that are within those areas. And we can see, and so this was taking sort of the most common city that they serve within that area. And so it's not sort of a precise geolocation of where each agency is, but you can see how that they're spread out across these different counties and across this sort of region. And so we can look at how these different outcomes differ across these sort of agencies. And I wanted to highlight just a few potential research questions that we can study within this. And so we can look at, when comparing agencies within the same county, whether it's Riverside, San Diego, whatever county you want to look at, how does agency type affect outcomes? Do sheriff's offices and police departments have different outcomes across those different measures that we discussed in terms of outcomes, in terms of actions? Is there a trend that one type of agency has more or less of one outcome? We can also look at sort of these questions of, do crime rates at the county level have sort of a relationship or a trend or correlation with different types of use of force or other actions that are taken within a stop? Is there a relationship that we can notice about how county statistics show up in the behavior of police agencies in the stop data? And we can also look at across counties, which counties have the higher rates of these different trends, which ones have lower rates, and sort of the relative trends across regions. And so there are more questions that we can ask in this type of analysis than we can sort of put up on a set of slides. And that's in part because the analysis lends itself to this almost Mad Lib type of question asking. How does X agency and regional factor influence the outcome of interest Y? And you can sort of sub in the different agency and regional factors that I listed with the different outcomes. And so these are the same list of ideas that I listed in the previous slide, but we can mix and match it. You know, how does county population influence the agency percentage of stops of different racial groups? How does it affect different outcomes of stops? And through the analysis, we can ask this sort of multifaceted question because we can account for all of those different agency and regional factors simultaneously. We don't have to look at them one by one. We can look at them simultaneously and help to determine which are sort of the most influential or the most directly correlated with those outcomes of interest. And it allows us to sort of ask a bigger question of what's driving the difference in agency results that we see across the state. And so that is our proposal for the first analysis of the region of this agency level regional factors, which has been of interest to the board. The second set of analyses is looking at stop data, and it's looking at, again, the stop level, which is how the data comes originally. The board suggested that we look at the life cycle of stops to understand how these different factors within a stop in terms of demographics, actions are related within a stop. And there's limitations within that idea of the life cycle of a stop or the escalation of a stop or the process of a stop, because we can break a stop down into several stages and we can understand the relationship between those stages, but the data does not allow us to understand sort of all of the sequencing that occurs. Within the stop data as it is collected, we do not record the order of events within a stop. We do not know within those actions that are taken which occurs first. The stop data is collected as sort of a flat moment in time. And so we don't know what occurs first, what occurs second, but we can, based on some basic assumptions, create what I've identified as 4 stages of a stop. We can identify 4 things that happened at distinct moments in time. And the first stage is the demographics of the person that is stopped and the officer, that those precede the stop. Although the stop data is sort of the officer's perception, and so if one wants to get philosophical in a way, the person being stopped's gender and race are created by the officer in that moment. But if we assume that the demographics pre-existed the stop, that the person being stopped is being accurately recorded, and that those demographics existed before the stop, all of that preceded anything that occurred. And so as that all occurs before the stop, the stop begins with the location and the reason for the stop, and also the means of transportation, whether it's a vehicle stop, a pedestrian stop. All of that happens after the person's demographics exist in sort of the metaphysical space. And that is the first stop and the first reason, whether there was a call for action or whether it was an officer initiated stop. That is all the first step of the stop and where the stop begins. The third stage or step of a stop is when the actions occur, whatever occurs during the stop. After the stop has begun and whatever occurs during the stop is a third step. And I'll speak more about that to be really clear about what we can and can't do there. And as a fourth stage of a stop, there is a result of a stop, which concludes the stop, whether there's an arrest, no action. And so there are these four distinct areas of a stop, which we can understand as a sequence. But within actions in particular, which was of interest, we cannot create a sequence. And I don't want to sort of overly emphasize this point or hammer it, but I wanted to be very clear that we cannot understand sort of the life cycle of a stop or how different actions influence each other, because we cannot identify which action occurred first. We do not record that in the data. And so we can't say how that action 1 leads to action 2, escalates to action 3. We can understand what occurs within a stop together. And what we can study is how that, if one action does occur, that there is a higher or lower likelihood of a different action occurring also. That there are certain sets of actions that tend to occur together. That if action A occurs, there is a higher chance that action B will also occur. But we can't say whether action A or action B occurred first, or that action A caused action B or led to action B, just that action A and action B both co-occur. And so that's one limitation within the data, that there's nothing that we can really do, but we can study sort of how actions occur within a stop as sort of a co-occurrence. But with this analysis, we can study how these four stages or four steps of analysis impact each other, because there is a relationship and sort of a sequencing of those stops. And so we can understand, for instance, how demographics differ and influence sort of the reason for stops within stops as a second stage. And we can simultaneously understand how demographics end up impacting the result of stop. And so with a structural equation model, it allows us to simultaneously understand how earlier stages influence the following stage, how the demographics impact the reason for stop, how the reasons for stop impact actions, how that actions impact result of stop. But we can simultaneously understand how that those influence the end of those all four stages together too, and how the demographics influence the result of stop, how the reason for stop affects the result of stop. And so it's a really multifaceted relationship within stops, how that these things co-occur. But a structural equation model allows us to disentangle that and to understand sort of the chain of influence within that. And so there's a lot of questions that this type of analysis can hopefully address and raise. There's probably more questions than we can wrap our heads around, but we have 5 sets of analyses or separate areas of inquiry that have been raised by the board that we wanted to sort of address and lay out. And of course, anything that we don't identify can be brought up later, can be asked later, and we will certainly find more to ask as we go into this. But the first set of questions is about stops and actions. And all of this comes out of the previous board meetings and what was requested. But so the first sort of set of questions about stop and actions, we were asked to look at how that sort of actions are likely to co-occur during a stop and sort of the relationships within actions of a stop, and looking specifically in that stage of a stop. But we can also look at how that different stages interact and how that demographics change the odds of certain actions being taken, or how that actions influence the odds of certain outcomes as a result of stop. And so looking at actions as sort of the key area of a stop as one stage of the analysis. The board is also often very interested in sort of questions around consent, and we were asked to sort of look at and compare these different types of consent that we have in the data, verbal, implied, and written, as sort of one set of actions that can be taken. and how, whether that there are disparities in the type of consent given by different groups, both in terms of how the consent is given and also sort of the type of search that is conducted. But we can also look at that as sort of a factor that drives outcomes or the results of stops in terms of whether there is discovery and other types of outcomes from each individual stop. Of interest this year is the new bicycle stop variable within the 2024 RIPA data. And so we are also asked to look at type of stop, which of course is from that sort of second stage as I laid it out. And so it was requested that we would look at sort of the differences in search and discovery by those different types in terms of automotive, bicyclist, and pedestrian. And also being able to look at how do search rates and discovery differ across those different groups. And so that's one sub-question that we can fit in within sort of looking at those different stages of a stop. The fourth set of questions relate to the duration of stop, which in a way is an outcome of stop. It's something that comes at the end of a stop and sort of is the totality of how long the stop has taken. And so we can compare different inputs or different stages and how those impact the different duration of a stop in terms of do demographic types drive duration of stop or have differences that show up in the data? Do different types of search type influence and impact how long a search takes? And whether there are different actions during a stop, either taken in sort of combination or in isolation, that end up having an influence or an impact on how long a stop takes, and of course whether the result of stop is sort of a driving factor in how long a stop occurs. And the final set of questions that we wanted to highlight that the board has highlighted in previous meetings, and then I'll take any questions on all of this. But the reason for stop and going back to calls of service and officer initiated stops, whether officers initiating the stop, whether there is sort of differences in who they choose to stop and how that they display discretion within those stops. And looking across sort of those two stop categories can provide us some insight into potential officer bias at sort of the individual level. And so looking again at whether there are demographics that drive those, and that also can relate to sort of the officer level data. And are there differences that show up in the results of stop determined by how the stop begins, whether it's an officer initiated or a call for service? And so looking within the stops in this way is this sort of multifaceted, multi-stage process allows us a new way to disentangle these relationships and identify some of the factors that are driving differences within the data. And so I look forward to your feedback and questions, and look forward to, spending the year doing these wonderful analyses. So I will stop sharing my screen, although I can go back to anything if anybody wants clarification. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Are there questions or comments for Eric at the moment? Can I just say, so Eric, you had a slide where you're kind of abstracting out the stages of the stop, and I just want to clarify when you're saying, oh, we don't have an order or of actions during a stop, just to make it very, transparent. You had in the abstract like action 1, action 2, action 3, and so when you're saying that, what I'm imagining is, for example, if there's a stop that involves a search, and then also some very small fraction of stops result in an arrest. What you're saying is maybe there was a search and it led to some basis for arrest, or there might be a situation where someone was being arrested and as a part of that process there was a search conducted, and we don't know what order those actions happened in. I'm using arrest as an example, but again, it's a very small tiny fraction of a small fraction of stops overall. But is that what you're referring to? Just so we're all clear as a public and a board. When you're saying we have an order. Whereas for some things, maybe we do have an order. We should have an order, for example, if consent was used as a basis for a search, then implicitly there is some ordering there. But okay, I just wanted to make sure that I don't know if that's helpful or not to us as a board, but that when you're, abstracting out these stages, that it ties back to these concrete actions during a stop that could happen. Are there any questions or comments that others have? I think in my mind, we're looking ahead to, we're going to look at the draft report, listed many possible directions of inquiry. Eric, you laid out also this, like the life cycle of the stop. I'm not sure if that was in the original, the sort of proto draft we received. Darren, why don't I pivot to you? Go ahead. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you.
Board Green.
And Darren's fine, thanks. For 2023, there were 539 agencies reporting, and then 533 in 2024. What happened to the other 6? Did they just not report, or was their information received late, or how did that come about?
I cannot answer that question offhand. We're sort of secondary to the data collection. It's handed to us. And so that's a great question for folks that work in the DOJ. And I'm not sure if Garrett or anyone else can speak to that, but it's something that we can get an answer for in a future presentation. I know that we were in on the meetings on all of the difficulties of collecting the data. And I'm not sure if those 6 agencies, I'm not sure whether there's sort of an individual explanation for each, or what whether they failed or whether potentially they closed. So I can't answer that immediately, but we can get an answer for that.
Board Member Green, thank you for raising that, and we would like to, of course, know, if there are changes in agencies, or in particular, if there's any non-compliance with reporting. I also, then circling back to what you first shared, the one data point we already have is the total number of stops. And it sounds like you said there's basically a 10% or so increase in the number of stops. And I was wondering if there was any sense of whether that was attributed to particular agencies, or if that's sort of roughly across the board. And I think that's something we'd like to know as well, that as just a general. Well, it might not be something you could answer right now.
It's a great question, and it's something I will highlight in whatever first preview I give to help. I can help to understand where that increase came from, whether it was specific agencies or a general trend across all.
And on that note, and maybe this is to all of DOJ. I'm trying to remember sort of historically at what point we get what window into the data. And I think our next meeting is as a full board. And so I'm wondering when, what that might mean. I know we're looking now ahead, projecting to future meetings in terms of seeing some kind of presentation about what this year's data is showing us. I guess I'm wondering, is that something that might be part of the next full board meeting, or is it actually not until a later subcommittee meeting, in which case it's starting to feel a little later in the year?
We should be getting ready to give previews of the data in future meetings. I don't have my calendar up to know when the next full board meeting is, but that should be possible.
Did the screen freeze?
It looks like board member Kajabi's tech
Yeah,
is
I
having
think-
issues.
I think we did lose board member Kajabi just briefly. If any other board members have questions for the team or other thoughts about presentations, we'd love to hear from them.
I think the report was good. It covered a lot of detail. It explained a lot where different things were happening. So I think it was I think it was awesome. And to see the difference between the 2 years and to see that maybe some agencies dropped off or we don't know what happened, but we will get to the bottom of that too. A lot of detailed information. I wonder, did it also cover that portion when we had that disruption, when we had the protest going on with the George Floyd? Did it cover that portion of it too? Did we see any disparity in reporting at that time? I'm just asking.
I have trouble knowing what day it is, but George Floyd, the protests over George Floyd were several years ago, correct?
Correct.
But so, I mean, so this data would be from 2024, so
Oh, no.
I'm sure that
it wouldn't have been
other
covered.
protests will be covered, but I don't think that that would influence the data for this year.
Okay, what about the other protests we had in 2024 where the college students were on the campuses protesting and outside the campuses protesting, and they were being stopped entering and leaving certain campuses? Was that data covered in this?
Any stop data and any stops in 2024 should be included in the data. So that may be a trend that could be identified in those locations and agencies where that happened.
So we have the data from the universities too?
Any agency that reports data to RIPA, we should have. I don't know offhand how universities, UC and CSU police departments are reporting agencies. And so that should be in the data if whatever stops did occur.
Hello, all. This is Board Member Kajabi. I'm sorry, I have some sort of connection problem. I have dialed in now, so I was also on phone able to hear some of the discussion. And I'll just add that a longitudinal analysis, to the extent there's some look at different years, then it's true that there's an impact, especially of COVID in particular. And so some of these questions about protests in years might be implicit in looking at the way one agency stop if we take that approach. So I want to thank you for raising that. But I imagine that for the past year, that's not actually as much of an impact statewide. I appreciate the question. Luanda, did you have other comments or questions?
No, thank you.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate that. Others have particular comments or questions? And I'm sorry, there may be a window that I missed. Okay, so yes, Board Member Green, thank you.
One last question about demographic data or time of day for calls for DOJ. I'd imagine that calls for service, the demographic data may change from time of day to time of day. for example, at 3 p.m., the demographics for calls for service will be significantly different than 3 a.m., depending on the agency or the county or the city. Is that something taken into account or can be broken down for stops and calls of service as time of day?
It may be. It's something that we can add and try to understand and disentangle. I understand your point that those things would shift throughout a day and probably shift within a week too, in terms of what day of the week it is. And so we may be able to identify that for the stops and create that as one factor to consider.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you for that window into the possibilities for this year. If there aren't other comments, questions folks want to raise in this moment, what I'm going to propose is that we pivot to the stop data, the section outline that was provided, and go through it maybe with an eye especially to the overall goals for this year's report, the theme of public safety, and then for some of the specific questions that board members have proposed, in particular for our minutes from last meeting reflect there were many specific items of interest raised by the board, and I really appreciate, thank you DOJ in this outline for reaching into, I hope essentially each and every one of those. So if it's okay with other board members, as we move into discussion, should we in particular, can we use that outline as our guide? And I guess I'm looking for, unless there are further updates from DOJ, I'm looking for a little thumbs up to pivot to that outline to frame our discussion. And I think I just saw something let me just see in the chat. Thank you, Noel, for providing the link for the public. Actually, before we do that, can I ask DOJ if there are any updates related to a data dashboard, and maybe we'll come back to that as part of our discussion as well. Any additional updates regarding a data dashboard?
Thank you, Co-Chair Kajabi. I don't want to speak for the entirety of the DOJ. I do want to be responsive to the Co-Chair's question. My understanding is that our office is hard at work selecting the appropriate vendor for the data dashboard for the that would produce a result that would properly respond to all of the particular areas that the dashboard needs to cover. So it is still a work in progress. We're still trying to find a data dashboard vendor to service the needs of not just obviously the RIPA board here, but also the public generally. And so I want to be very mindful of selecting and producing the proper dashboard for users. Understand that the dashboard is something that is very, very important and has been identified by not just this subcommittee, but other members of the board as something that is really important for the work of the RIPA board. So, we are definitely trying to make this happen as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much, Alex. And maybe I'll just add to that the very first, in the first presentation from DOJ today, Garrett, thank you for that. The question about ordering and different ways that the data can be analyzed, those questions really point straight line, I think, to having a data dashboard where the public can choose which factors they want to focus on and be able to look at intersections of race and other characteristics, and in particular race and identity and different outcomes. So as much as I know you're wrestling with what is in the report, the dashboard really would be a way not only to resolve some of those questions, but really to speak to public interest and accessibility of the data. So I'm in my own screen on this end, I'm opening up or bringing forward the outline that was provided us. And I'll just say, so the very first section, or after the introduction, the stop data analysis, I'd like us to talk briefly about that first. Garrett raised the question of sort of should data first be framed first and foremost with respect to identity. Before I do that, I do want to say it's two framing comments. One, a main theme for this year's report is public safety, and the policy subcommittee had a very rich discussion about this at the last meeting. And secondly, I see the data subcommittee as really doing two things. One, making sure that there's analysis that supports any section of the reports that is requests from other committees, that whatever analysis happens supports the work of all sections of the report. And then secondly, that we try to hone in on analyses where shining a light on the data can point to policy changes or change that can happen to improve the well-being of Californians across the state. And so as we go to look at specific questions, I'm asking us to keep in mind, are there topics that we can probe using the data that really point to policy changes or recommendations, or including changes that different agencies may have already made, and getting a sense of how effective those are. So with that, section 2 of this outline is about the stop data analysis overall. How should the stop data be organized by demographic group, by particular events? And I'm wondering if anyone has any strong feelings in light of what Garrett shared, or not strong feelings, but comfort with a variety of approaches. Board Member Green.
Thank you again. Just for how should stop data be presented, in my opinion, I think presenting all pertinent mitigating factors first, whether it's time of day, type of stop, calls for service that could influence the final number, and then presenting demographic data or event data. I think presenting, because sometimes these reports are a little lengthy. I think if we give all the pertinent information first, the reader can kind of see the point we're trying to make with the data and then go from there. But if we present demographic data first and then secondarily or the mitigating factors, those may be glossed over and we may move on to the next topic, or the reader may move on to the next topic.
Thank you, Board Member Green. So something I heard that was implicit in that is this is the first year where in particular vehicle, pedestrian, and bicyclist data can be disaggregated. And once the team has had a chance to really start to break down the stops for this year, it may be that it is very valuable to really look at let's say the driver experience and the pedestrian experience separately. Certainly in Los Angeles, historically, under the consent decree, both the demographics of stops and also what happened once there was a stop, for example, search and frisk rates were really different depending on the type of stop it was, a vehicle or a pedestrian stop. And I know Board Member Green referred to other aspects, in particular call for service. And so so I'd invite DOJ to look to see if there are pronounced differences in the demographics by type of stop, and then in fact it might be valuable to break down that way. We don't normally sort of call on folks here, but Board Member Dobard, I'm wondering, as co-chair of the policy subcommittee especially, and thank you so much for leading that meeting last week, if you had any reflections on this overarching question that the
Ye-
DOJ has asked.
Yes, so my inclination would be to frame, particularly for this report and given the theme we've identified, frame it in terms of demographics first, and then talking about factors within that context. And so I wonder if there's even the mitigating factors that Board Member Green has raised, if those can still be discussed still within that context. So it's not saying we don't talk about them, but it's talking about them within that context. The reason why I think that makes sense is the direction we're headed in is impact of profiling on public safety. And we are trying to understand the degree to which that impact is also disparate across groups. So because we're trying to understand that, to me, in my mind, it makes sense to frame up the data in that way.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Are there other board members who'd like to comment on this? Okay. All right. In light of that, I'd like us to take a look now at what was labeled as Section 3, additional analysis. And here you see, if you were to open that document, you'll see in particular that the policy subcommittee worked on a general, sort of a broad and general definition of public safety as the experience of community members feeling safe from threats to their lives or well-being. And so in light of that, are there particular stop data elements that we are that we might either focus on, or and maybe I'll add as a footnote, it's possible that some of this also will be addressed in the policies section and analyses that subcommittee is called for. But we do have an opportunity, if we'd like to discuss the particular theme further, the centering on public safety. And in particular, Board Member Dobard, I don't know if there's something you wanted to, I know you just spoke to this, but anything that you wanted to add in light of last week's discussion?
Not in particular. I'll just say, I mean, if we're framing it up by demographic group, what we still want to know is reason for the stop, actions taken during the stop, results of the stop. But it's the frame that is just changed here. So all of those are still going to be important for us. So there isn't anything that immediately jumps to mind for me as something to call out specifically. We still want to get to those different co-occurrences within a stop, but understanding them within that, again, that larger frame of demographic group.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to add to our discussion at this moment for the first part of additional analysis? Okay, and if not, what I'd like us to do is then, with an eye to the time, we're going to leave time for public comments to take a look at the potential areas that were listed. I really appreciate that DOJ captured the many suggestions that were made in our last subcommittee meeting. And so I'm wondering if we could look a little bit at each of these. And so the first one was this idea of, I'm going to call it concentration analysis. I'm going to refer to it broadly that way. There may be better terms because hotspot sometimes has different connotations in different settings. And so concentration analysis, and I think what I would like to maybe just grab the floor to make one point. Maybe this will come back to consent, but in the last meeting, Board Member Guerrero commented about the value of looking at the agency level or perhaps regionally, in particular how consent was used and how that is practices might vary by region. It might be by agency or by region. And so in terms of this concentration analysis, I'm actually wondering if it would be valuable, instead of trying to do every possible slice and dicing of data, that really hone in on questions we can look at where then there could be a policy or a change of practice and impact on law enforcement practice. Sorry. And so in particular, I see these bullet points, if I'm looking back at the proposed outline, consent type concentration. And what I'm interpreting that as is, are there agencies that are using, for example, consent as a basis for search when there aren't for potentially other bases for a search? Are those searches happening in a disparate way in terms of racial identity? And also possibly are the outcomes of those searches unproductive? I see stop duration, disparate search and discovery rate, and other racial disparities. So I guess what I'm inviting, and maybe Eric, this is to you, when you were looking at the geographical analysis, I'm maybe inviting DOJ to do it in a way that focuses on these particular types of outcomes or types of differences potentially in how law enforcement agencies are using consent, for example. I don't know if that made sense. I don't know if Eric, you want to pop back, but that the outcomes that are focused on,
Yeah,
if
so
there
we
is some
can,
sort of concentration analysis really tied directly to potential policy differences, either differences in policy or in implementation or just different practices agencies are using.
Yeah, so that is something that we can include in that. We can look at sort of the percentage of stops that have consent-only search and how that is associated with different sort of the outcomes that the agency sees or tends to see. And we can look at how that sort of regional factors influence sort of the consent and search of agencies. Those are the kinds of things that we can create and look at within that analysis, the regional agency analysis.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I didn't say that all in a very articulate way, but exactly that if the regional analysis would focus on these types of the potential types that the board had flagged earlier. Are there others who want to comment on this? Oh, thank you. Other board members who want to comment on this idea of looking at things regionally or the so-called concentration analysis? Okay, I'd like us to hop to the suggestion to look at pedestrian and bicycle stops. And so historically, it's been found in different regions, including Los Angeles and elsewhere, that the experience of drivers, pedestrians, and in fact, cyclists may be very different. That some of the disparities that we see along racial and ethnic lines may be more pronounced, in particular sometimes for pedestrians. And so I guess I'm looking to the subcommittee for some sense that we think this would be a valuable frame for analysis. That is, and whether it happens here or it's part of it, an earlier section. But this is the first year that we can easily separate out the experience for drivers versus pedestrians versus cyclists. Maybe I'm hearing this as tacit approval that this could be a valuable point of information.
Are we going? Please go ahead.
I was just going to briefly say I do think this would be a helpful form of analysis. That's it.
And Board Member Green, thank you. Thank you so much, Board Member Smith.
I think for these types of stops, if we can provide as much context as possible, demographics is one thing for a county, city, or area, but also time of day. 3 p.m. if you're stopping a lot of bikes and searching them, that would raise some flags. But at 3 a.m. you're stopping bikes with no lights, that won't raise any flags. So it as long as we as long as all the data is there, everything we can use to make a informed decision about what's in front of us is made available.
Thank you. So I think what I heard behind the scenes of that too is that the basis for the stop is maybe important to see what officers are indicating as a basis for stop. And so that maybe that's a through line throughout, but in particular for the bicycle stops, Board Member Green gave an example. So maybe as a subcommittee, I'd like us to think about what nuance, because it could very directly shine a light not only on policing practices but towards policy recommendations. What nuance might be needed or valuable for some of these sections. I'm gonna pop to the next, which was analysis of consent searches. And I know I've mentioned this many times, but I'm still going to say it again. I think this is a particularly important area of police practice for the board to examine, and where there are possible recommendations that can remove some officer discretion, where historically there have been patterns of strong, how should I say, just for very pronounced disparities, especially for Black and brown drivers, the use of consent as a basis for search when there aren't necessarily other bases. I saw in the DOJ presentation the referring to verbal, implied, and written consent, and I'm wondering if someone can remind me from DOJ offhand if the new data collection, so this is the first year we have these new data elements, if that included distinguishing those three types of consent: verbal, implied, or written. And if no one knows offhand, that's all right too, but I'm very curious to hear from DOJ if someone remembers offhand.
Oh, yeah. So the question is the, oh, sorry, Alex, if you want to answer this, go ahead. But that consent given, there's different boxes for verbal, written, and implied by conduct.
Okay.
Right. So that those should be selected when the officer or whatever is completing the form.
Okay. Then I have a companion request, and this is, I think, an easier one. If the board could be provided a, I'll call it a code book, but just a reminder. I know we had over the years discussions. So there's a lengthy process for California to modify the data elements that DOJ was shepherding, and at times the board got a window into those, but I'm wondering if it might be valuable, since this is the first year with that sort of data, to either provide the subcommittee or the board as a whole sometime in the coming weeks, a list of all the data elements, or a so-called code book for the data. That would be much appreciated. Are there any board members who want to add particular comments, concerns, questions about the idea of analysis of consent searches as being part of the what's analyzed? Okay, then I'd like us to move to the next category. It says here, or the next item was analysis of officers' self-identified race. And then I also heard in the presentation time, that the length of time that an officer has served. So looking at how officer identity interacts or not with just how the stop is, the outcomes during the stop, or the actions during the stop. So this was suggested in our last meeting. Are there any board members who want to add to the discussion about this part of the report? This is, again, something new that we can do this year that we weren't able to in the past. And maybe I'll add, I had to drop off before the end of the last subcommittee meeting. Board Member Dobard, I'm wondering if, and the answer might be no, whether the policy subcommittee had entertained any questions about officer identity or length of time that an officer has served relative and to these. And sorry, go ahead.
No, that has not come up yet.
Okay, all right, that's fine. And I'm also wondering if anyone here is part of the post subcommittee or officer training. And I wonder if this kind of analysis actually might be of interest in particular to that subcommittee, especially if it also includes the time that's someone to serve as an officer. Okay, so I think this could be a very valuable point of inquiry. Board Member Green?
You were asking for the post subcommittee. I'm sorry, there's a vacuum cleaner right outside
yes.
my room.
Sorry, thank you.
That's okay. So for officer race identified, I'm sorry, could you just repeat the question you asked for the stop subcommittee or
Right,
for
yeah,
post
so
subcommittee?
So I'm looking at the outline that was provided by DOJ for additional areas of analysis, and many of these are related to questions we couldn't have answered in the past, the data we had. And one is the fact that we have officer self-identified race. And this is something that I think some researchers have looked at in the past. Many years ago, for example, in San Diego, was there some impact relative to the race of whoever stopped? And then if you look at the perception of the driver, let's say, who stopped, and then officer race, and then when you look at search rates or other outcomes of the stop, do we see, for example, so I think what they found in the past is when there was a disjunction, so a driver identified one race, officer of another race, there was more likely that there was a search, for example, during the stop. So this is a finding in San Diego many, many years ago. And so looking at possible disparities in search or also in discovery and so on with an eye to officer race. And you've mentioned in the past that you thought also, I think earlier in this meeting, that how long someone had been an officer as well was might be of interest. So you were, sorry, you rate. So this is the item that we're looking at now. I don't know if that speaks to your question, and I don't know if you have some input you'd like to shape in what we look at here.
It is an interesting question, officer's race versus the party being stopped or searched race, but it kind of lends to, I don't know, you get what you're looking for, I guess. If you're looking for one demographic is searching another demographic more, I think you may find that, but I think to go beyond the race of an officer and the race of the individual may be speaks more to the officer's background more and then less of the race. If I have a bilingual officer who speaks fluent Spanish, I think their workday is going to go a lot smoother than the same ethnic or officer who has the same background as the individual they're stopping, but they don't speak their language. So I think it would go beyond the race of the individual, and I don't know how you quantify that in data though. And if we're making sweeping policy recommendations, I think we should have more than just what's on the surface to make those suggestions.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. I mean, one reason I think this item is of interest is it goes to a question of sometimes we'll say, well, if, as we are diversifying the state and as law enforcement has diversified, is that changing outcomes, or are there aspects of policy and culture of policing that that feed into issues that we see? And so for that reason, I think a question like this is of interest, but I'm wondering if other board members want to weigh in. And actually, I apologize. I think Board Member Smith had his hand up, and I'm not sure if he's.
Yeah, I'm here. Board member.
Thank you. Did you want to add to this? Thank you.
Actually, I had a question, and I took my hand down because you seemed to partially answer it during your last comment, and that the question was essentially, what are we trying to get to, and including the analysis of officers' self-identified race. And you started to speak to that when you were explaining the example of the relationship between the officer's self-identified race and then the race of the person being stopped, the relationship to the different types of actions that could occur during a stop, to tease out whether racial differences can impact, what happens. So I guess to confirm, that's the lens through which we're looking at this issue area. Okay, yeah, that was it. And you started to answer. That's why I took my hand down. But yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you. Others who want to add to this section? Okay, there are two more remaining. One was analysis of duration, oh, three more, excuse me. Analysis of duration of stop, also longitudinal analysis now that we have wave one agency stop data for a number of years. And then finally, looking in particular at agencies that have language prohibiting pretextual stops, looking at the impacts of those. I think all of three of these are very valuable. We haven't looked at duration stop, at least in recent years, much. But Chauncey, did you want to go ahead? Are you able to unmute?
Yes.
Thank you.
And thinking about the topic of the racial differences again, I see that we have the sub bullet point on search and discovery rates. Another thing that might be good to look at is uses of force within that context.
Thank you for that comment. Appreciate that. So I want to be mindful of a time for public comment. So maybe I'm going to add one comment about the pretextual stop section. I think in public comment before and discussions in the policies committee, there was the remark that different agencies may have taken very different approaches to what they consider to be pretextual stops and what it meant to prohibit them. And so some of that may be reflected in the policies, the report, either analyses of particular agencies or in how the data is analyzed. So this section on pretextual stops fits perfectly in supporting not only the overall goals of the report, the RIP analysis, but also the policies subcommittee section in particular. And so, and then likewise, well, actually, let me stop there. Are there any board members who want to add any comments in general to these potential areas for inclusion? Either adding more nuance to any of these or additional recommendations? All right, and then maybe I'll just say very generally, so this is a challenge for DOJ that because there's a new data set, a new type of data that's being collected, that is some additional variables, it's opened up the door to many more types of analysis. And as that takes shape and we have a sense to, have an opportunity rather to look at the initial findings, that may shape what the final report can look like, how we work these all in with the theme of public safety and so on. So, this is how should I put it? It looks like I know we've got a bigger challenge now in front of DOJ for the analysis, but I think each of these subtopics could be very valuable. So Alex, I saw you come on screen. Did you want to add anything to that?
I was just about to say almost the same thing, Board Member Kajabi. I really thank the subcommittee for consideration of these potential topics. Because we don't have the data and we haven't analyzed the data yet. There was questions of viability or whether the data will show things that will be of interest to the subcommittee to report out about. So I want to just, with that caveat, with that qualifier, that these topics are potential topics until we analyze the data. So thank you.
Okay. That's right. What I'd like to do is hop right to public comment if we're able to. Let me just take a moment here to align again my agenda. So what we've done in the past is move, if we can, let's say from Northern to Southern California. And as I see people with their hands up, actually, maybe we'll do it in that order. So I see Michelle Wittig, Michelle, can I invite you to unmute and share your comments with us? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. Are you able to hear me?
I can
Are
hear
you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Yes, oh, good.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to make three brief points. First of all, several law enforcement agencies have made policy changes to limit stops and citations for low-level, non-safety related vehicle violations. And as we know, others have enacted limitations on pretextual stops. For this reason, this year's stop data analyses might sort by whether a given law enforcement agency has enacted each of these policy reforms to be able to discern their so-called effects. Second, the board might consider developing and widely disseminating a template for local law enforcement agencies to use as the outline for their local reports. The template would include the essential data charts and associated narrative that would meet a minimal standard of transparency. Third, regarding establishing the likely sequence of events and stops, testing the fit of one structural equations model that specifies perception of race as a predictor of a given outcome against an alternative model specifying perception of race as merely a co-occurrence with a given outcome would be very helpful. And a fourth point, the board will soon have published 10 years of reports. It might ask the DOJ to create a document that distills the major insights the board has achieved into one summative document. This document would take into account new data elements that have been added over the years, as well as critiques of the early reports, and articulate the board's current understanding of the nature and occurrence of racial and identity profiling, its relationship to pretext stops, and similar contentious issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. Appreciate it. Are there other members of the public who would like to comment at this time? And if so, is it possible to initiate the raise hand feature? And I see the Jamaican. Please go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you.
This has been very stimulating. I like it. But it's also very disappointing. And it is disappointing because people who should know more than I do appear not to know as much as I do. I like to be taught when I come to these places, and I do not think that is happening. First, with respect to data, I believe that I'm in the presence of the California Department of Justice, or at least this meeting is being held under the auspices of that department. And it therefore means that, like Caesar's wife, it should be perceived as being faultless. It is not. If I ask the Department of Justice for data, the law requires that it deliver that data and it respond to my request in a timely fashion. It just merely ignores them. So that is not good, and it ought to be rectified. It's been over 2.5 months, and I need the data to be sensible when I come to this place, and I'm only half sensible because of data. I don't remember what else I have to say, but I'm disappointed, and I wish that were not the case. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And are there other members of the public who wish to share to inform the work of the subcommittee or the board? And if there's any member of the public who's unable to use the Teams raise hand function, but is able to unmute on a phone at this time, please go ahead. All right, I'm not seeing other indicators from members of the public. Thank you very much for those who shared your comments, your insightful comments, and public comment is such a valuable part of these meetings to us. So I tremendously appreciate it. And so before we adjourn, pivoting to our next steps, I think that we're in a state now where we laid out a broad agenda for DOJ. We've a rich data set, a little different from in past years. And so I'm personally very much looking forward to seeing the preliminary analysis. I appreciate also the questions that were raised, including from Board Member Green, seeing if there are agencies that didn't. There were a small number of agencies. It looks like we have fewer agencies that reported out this year than last year. Finding out what the explanation for that is. And in particular, as a board, we'll be looking to see why there was such a large increase in number of stops. And as well as all the myriad of points of analyses that have been suggested and proposed. Are there any board members who want to add some specific call for next steps? I see that as we start to see the preliminary analysis, that will really inform our recommendations, but other points that anyone wanted to raise or in general for this subcommittee. All right, with that, I'm going to ask for DOJ. Are there additional comments, anything you'd like us to be aware of or looking ahead to, including in terms of scheduling, anything to keep an eye out for? I know that our next board meeting is on the books. Alex, please.
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair Kajabi. Yes, the next full board meeting, second full board meeting of the year is currently calendared for July 11. July 11 is going to be the next full board meeting, July 11 from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. I hope to see everybody there. And thank you, as always, for your time, your effort, your commitment to this important subcommittee and to the RIPA board generally.
Thank you so much, and I greatly appreciate the efforts of DOJ. It's going to be a very rich report this year. Although it's a little side comment, first of all, I apologize. I had to drop off at some point. I don't know what happened with the video, so I greatly appreciate the chance to connect everyone, see your beautiful faces here. And I also want to include the side reminder to DOJ. I know it was one of many things on the to-do list, but providing the code book with the new variables, if that's easy to do, that doesn't have to wait for a board meeting, that would be very helpful, even if it's just coming to the subcommittee. All right. Well, I don't know if we have to have a motion to adjourn. If so, I'd entertain one. Or what is the will of the subcommittee here? Alex, are you going to weigh in?
We do need a motion in a second, but no, but it's not a roll call vote. Just as long as there's no objections, then we can adjourn. Okay, so we can by affirmation adjourn, I guess, by general. Well, yeah. So as you said, motion and second, and then all right. Are there any? Is there any movement to adjourn? Yes. John Nobar was ready. Thank you. And any second to that? Okay, Luanda, I saw you indicate a second. All right. Well, with that, our meeting today is complete. Thank you for all rolling with technical difficulties and others, and appreciate it. And looking forward to seeing you all in July to continue the important work of the board. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.